Hi everyone. So I managed to find some time during my reservice. We have a little break, so I was thinking of doing this video that I promised that I'll be doing. So following up from our previous video where I wanted to do a crash course for Windows, I thought it would be a good idea to move on to the next kind of OS that we commonly see in organizations now, which is Linux. So for most organizations, they tend to use several distributions. The three common ones that we usually see is Ubuntu. This can be more because of its UIs, and tentatively it's more for end users that just wants to do some developing work or want to just try out Linux because of the friendly UI. The next one will be Red Hat. So a lot of organizations, especially government agencies, love to use Red Hat. First of all, it's because on the back end, Red Hat provides a service for Linux that supplies a lot of the security features for it, and it's quite good at doing centralized managements, which a lot of organizations find it very convenient, especially when it comes to Linux security. Next will be CentOS. So CentOS is quite popular because number one, it's technically free and it gets the job done. It's a very small distro which is easy to run on machines. So these are the three that you're gonna see, but ultimately the base form is just another form of Linux that what we're going to go through today will be applicable to these distros. Okay, so there'll be several things that we're going to be touching on. Kernel is one of them. Network, your applications and services, and lastly would be your access controls. So these four are basically the main parts of Linux, but honestly it's quite a extensive list when it comes to OSs. Similarly to Windows, which has much more than what I could go through, but I was thinking of the more common areas attackers try to leverage or try to attack, and hopefully with you trying to get into cybersecurity or you need a refresher course, this would be something good for you to just remember and take note. The risks that you see in organizations when it comes to this OS and these components, and then what you can do about them. So first thing, let's touch on kernel. So kernels, like what I previously said for Windows, they are basically processors or services, the instruction codes inside your OS that handles low-level machines, so low-level instructions and tasks. So this could be your bin function, your bootstraps function, especially when you're loading. So bootstrap means whenever your machine starts, there's a list of instructions that needs to be run before the controls are handed to you. So this processes or this list of things is called bootstrap, where they bootstrap to the start of the machine. So for this, ultimately you need to know that most of the time attackers want to take over this kernel, because if they have the ability to control the kernel, essentially the whole machine is theirs. They have full controls of every part of your file systems, every part of your controls, your services, and that's where they can really do full havoc without any restrictions whatsoever. It's essentially giving them super user privileges, and so that's one of the kind of risks that you're trying to take note of, because this is ultimately one of the bigger targets that attackers are going for. That being said, some of the bigger vectors that I usually see in my organization when it comes to Linux is trying to get people to run dodgy or cracked or pirated software for Linux, or distro repos for Linux, and basically they have malware embedded into them. So some of the experience or some of the things that I see is an example that I have, which happened to me while I was doing my investigation, was that someone was trying to run a third-party distro through GitHub. So this GitHub distribution was done by this person, whoever this was. But apparently this person had malicious intent behind it, and when he opened up the distro and the repo to this person, he downloaded everything, and it actually downloaded libraries of instructions that were actually able to compromise the machine and attack the kernel. So this is the one thing that you really need to be very aware of, is running very suspicious or dodgy software on your Linux distro. So be aware, always try to make sure that you be aware of things that are being run on your Linux machine. So what are some of the mitigations or remediations that we can go for? So first thing first is quite similar to Windows. In fact, if you implement this, a lot of your problems can be solved. Whenever you are running Linux, always make sure that the person running it has only the required permissions to do the task, right? Give him the lowest permission needed so that he can do his task to the maximum. What that means is that if the person can get by with just readme privileges, give the person privileges. Never allow the person to run as a root. And talking about root, make sure root is disabled from connecting directly from external sources. So what I mean about this is that sometimes people, in most cases, Linux isn't used as a machine directly to interact with. Most of the time it's running on a server and people will have to remote into it. There is a configuration in your Linux distro that allows you to make sure that users aren't allowed to directly log in as root. So root is essentially your privilege to access every part of your machine, right? So that's one thing that you can do. Give a person an account that has just the right amount of privileges needed. So that's one thing that you can do. The other thing that you can do is turning on syslog. So turning on syslog within your distro and logging all that logs into a separate server allows you to monitor the machine for all the different actions. Because Linux distro tentatively don't run on GUI, it runs on commands. It's quite verbose in the kind of information that is going on the software itself, the OS itself. The things that you see in the logs are quite meaningful. So always have a syslog to log your machine's actions. This is also very important when it comes to doing investigations. So when it comes to investigations, this was taught to me when I was at SANS course, and I was doing the forensics course. The instructor was saying, right, without logs, you can't do anything, right? So logs, monitor logs. If you can get logs, that's where you are able to trace back, find out the root causes. Without it, you're just looking at a blank slate and you aren't able to figure out any cause, and it becomes very difficult in your investigations, right? So the next thing that we'll be going into is networks. Okay, so network, when it comes to distro, it's quite similar to Windows, where we are interested in what the machine is trying to connect to and what are the connections from your external sources coming into your distros. As people who are diving into cybersecurity, I'm sure you are aware that there are many different ways people try to exploit the networks of the OS. Sometimes they might try to SSH into your Linux machine, or try to FTP or SMB into your machine. Essentially just trying to find a different way to get an interactive shell onto your machine and try and wreak havoc, right? So what are the things that you can do about it is you utilize the machine's IP tables. Essentially, it's an updated version of the firewall, host firewall available onto your Linux OS. Even though this is not exactly the be-all and all solution when it comes to networking, this is at least a layer that you can rely on to add on to the multiple security layers that comes to your overall environment network. I would expect your company or your organization to at least have a separate firewall that will deal with most of the issues, most of the attacks from external before it actually enters into your machine. But at least if it does go to your machine, if you configure your firewall, host firewall or IP tables properly, that will mitigate far more. So when it comes to IP tables, similar to firewalls, you're trying to control what goes in and out. In most cases, people tend to suggest the zero trust methodology when it comes to networking. The interesting part is that the policy tells you that block everything and only allow those that are needed. The issue that I have with this, especially for organizations, is that when it comes to business, it's very difficult to know what is blacklisted and what is considered something that you can exclude, or what ports can be excluded, what IP can be excluded. And if this machine handles multiple multiple locations, you're going to have a whole mess of IPs and ports to deal with, right? So one of my suggestions when it comes to networking and blocking, right, is to block the common non-essential ports. So straight away, if your machine has nothing to do and it's not needed, it's not a file server or anything, you can straight away disable FTP ports. You can straight away drop out ports that will allow people to access your machine. You can also take away all your uncommon ports, so all your high ports, uncommon high ports, I think about 1,000 plus and above ports, you can close it down as well. And also, if this is available to you in your organization, sometimes most organizations has a IP range that they use throughout your whole entire network. And if you do, great, you can whitelist those and just close everything else. That will reduce the risk down when it comes to networking. So another thing you can do, another mitigation, another thing to help when it comes to this networking attack vector is to, like I said before, manage and log your traffic, right? So syslog again, ensuring that your networks are being monitored, so you know what's going in and you know what's going out. I think if I'm correct, syslog in itself can be configured to do some logging as well. So that's one thing that you should always know. You should always be able to trace back what your machine is doing. The more information you have, the easier it is for you to drill down and investigate what happened in case there really was an attack. So moving on to the next point that we have, which is your services and your applications. Okay, so this is quite similar to my first point, which is your kernels. So I'm going to be very brief about this, right? Be aware of the kind of libraries, the kind of drivers, files or scripts that you're running onto the machine. Always know where things are coming from, because from my experience, when I'm dealing with investigations from my organizations, one of the biggest weaknesses that I see is that people aren't vigilant on what they're running on their machines most of the time, because maybe budget cuts or they haven't factored it in. People aren't able to get software that they need required for the work, and they usually resort to free software or free libraries that are available out there without knowing that, most of the time attackers use these as a way to lure people to run suspicious or malicious scripts onto their machine, right? So when it comes to services and applications, the same thing. You don't want to run something that you shouldn't, that didn't come from a legitimate source. For Red Hat, it's usually not that big of an issue because they do have their own resources for security, that like SE Linux, that deals with these suspicious applications. But for us, you and me, might not be that easy, especially if you're using your Ubuntu or using other distributions. There are a few ways you can deal with this. Number one is that you can actually install Defender onto your machine. Yes, a Microsoft Defender there's a Linux version that is running on the machine as well. That's something you can actually utilize. That's quite interesting. The other thing is that utilize all your SE Linux. Even without the Red Hat distribution, there are some security features already on your OS that handles these malicious activities and handles running and executing scripts that might be a bit dodgy. Once again, I'm going to drum this again. Get your syslogs up. This allows you to figure out if, say, a user runs a really dodgy application or library. At least you have the logs to figure out when he ran it, what he ran, when it came from, what it's connecting to. So at least you have the logs to go and trace back to it. The other thing is that the most important, I feel, is that manage your privileges properly, right? If an application doesn't need execute privileges, don't give it execute privileges. Okay, let's go back to a bit more fundamentals when it comes to privileges in Linux. Linux is really funny. For each file and each folder, they have permissions for itself, right? Usually in layman terms, they have 3 categories of privileges allowed. And then that would be read privileges, write privileges, and execute privileges, right? Each file has this form of permissions on it. When it comes to dodgy applications, make sure that these are disabled if it are needed, or at most read permissions as well. The fantastic thing about Linux is that not only do the folders have permissions, it has ownerships as well. So the ownerships of the accounts, basically the file has an owner as well. The owner has certain privileges to exert things onto it, to read, to execute, or to override it as well. So there's this matrix of permissions that each user and folder has within this Linux. That's something that you can utilize whenever you're trying to deal with Linux. And the last thing will be your services. So for your services, I didn't mention this before, but one thing that you need to take note is that there could be things that are running in the background in Linux that you might not be aware of. Two that you really need to know is number one, cron, which is something that is very commonly used. Essentially, it's a script, or the equivalent to Linux, equivalent to Windows, is basically scheduled tasks. And so most of the time, attackers love to embed their scripts or malicious activities within cron so that it doesn't trigger at this point in time when it was infected, but it has a rule that maybe down the line every 5 minutes to ping this C2 server, or to run this script in the background, or to run a backdoor, right? So that's one thing that you should take note of. So there's a particular place that most of all the cron scripts, basically the instructions for the automation to start, I'll show it on screen now. And then that's one area that if you see any cron that doesn't feel like it's something that you placed into it, then you should really take note, investigate, and see if you can remove it if it's not needed. Next would be your services. Unlike Windows, it's not that easy, but if you put SC, you get a list of all the services that are running. Ensure that there's no services that are suspicious. Make sure that most of all the services are things that you are aware of, running from legitimate sources, and to disable or remove any that are from really dodgy applications. And it's quite obvious that it's very dodgy because number one, the name of the service doesn't match with any of your running things. And in most of your services, the fantastic thing is that there is a table that usually tells you what files are related to that service that you can actually dive and look into, so that you can start removing any folders or applications that you really don't want to run on your machine. And then so a bonus action, or the bonus thing that you should really look into, is in your file or your folders of systems. There are common places that attackers love to run their scripts, and usually that is within the temp folder of your Linux, right? So added bonus is that try to disable your execute ability on that folder as well. This kind of helps reduce the risk of making sure that nothing within that folder runs on its own. So if you really hope that this, I really hope that all this is something that helps you in understanding more about the risks and the things that you can do for Linux. I know it's a bit messy, but if you have any questions, do put it down in the comments. I'll be glad to try and answer them for you. And drop in any comments for any future things that you want to take note of, or anything that you want to learn, so how I can create a video on. So if this was really helpful for you, do like and subscribe. And until the next video, I'll see you next time.